The cell phone slipped off the table like a trivial detail, but that slip was enough to change the course of the evening. The maid, young, black, in a tight, discreet uniform, merely bent down to pick up the device. But as she accidentally turned on the screen, a secret pulsed before her eyes. Photos, messages, proof of something that should never have been seen. Her heart raced. The silence around her seemed to scream, and in a matter of seconds the millionaire realized. His face paled. His breathing became heavy, and for the first time in his life the roles were reversed. It wasn't the maid trembling before her boss. It was he who, desperate, begged. The powerful man, respected by all, knelt before the young woman, his eyes brimming with tears, and let out the most unexpected plea, that she not reveal what she had just discovered. The entire room became a silent courtroom. The maid clutched her cell phone with trembling hands, her eyes wide, shocked by the weight of the secret she now carried. The millionaire, kneeling at her feet, wept, his voice choked, begging her to remain silent. The guests, not understanding the scene, approached curiously, and the rumor spread like wildfire. What had that woman seen? The millionaire's wife, across the room, narrowed her eyes, sensing something terrible was about to be revealed. Every second of silence felt like a blow, and everyone waited for the revelation that could destroy not just a marriage, but an entire empire of appearances. If you felt the power of this story in these first moments, imagine what's yet to come. Every detail holds a twist. Every silence conceals a weight. Take the opportunity to like and subscribe to the channel so you can journey together to the end of this narrative, where destiny always reveals its face. The mansion was lit like a temple of luxury. Crystal chandeliers reflected golden light on the walls, glasses clinked in empty toasts, and sharp laughter cut the air like invisible knives. Amidst long dresses and impeccable suits, the waitress walked with measured steps, carrying a tray as if it were just part of the furniture. Her eyes rarely lifted. She had already learned that, in this place, the more invisible she was, the easier it would be to survive. But that night her invisibility was shattered by a banal accident. On the main table, the millionaire's cell phone vibrated insistently. A notification flashed, but no one noticed. No one except the maid arranging glasses around. However, as she stepped away, the device slipped from the edge and fell to the floor with a dull thud that echoed louder than expected. She instinctively bent down to pick it up, and it was in that simple gesture that fate changed. The screen lit up. A photo, a message, a fragment of truth that should never have been exposed to prying eyes. The young woman's heart raced. Her fingers froze for a second, and her eyes couldn't help but decipher what was there. It was no ordinary message. It was something that could destroy much more than a marriage. It was a secret capable of imploding the castle of appearances built around that man. The millionaire noticed almost immediately. His eyes, accustomed to reading human expressions like someone reading a contract, noted the shock on her face. He hurried forward, and within seconds he was standing before the scene. Their eyes met, and in that instant, the balance of power shifted. The maid, until then the target of scorn, now held in her hands a secret that the most influential man in the room could never allow to be revealed. She tried to return the phone, still confused, but the millionaire gripped her hand firmly. His breathing was heavy, his face etched with barely concealed panic. For the first time, he didn't look untouchable. He looked human and fragile. The guests around them still didn't understand what was happening. They only saw the sudden movement, the owner of the house bowing before the maid as if begging for something. Whispers began to spread through the room. No one had ever seen this man bow before anyone. But now, before everyone's eyes, he looked desperate. The maid felt the weight of the moment. Her body trembled, her mind trying to process what she'd seen on the screen, but there was no erasing it from her memory. The millionaire knew this, and that was why, breaking the cold, imposing image he'd maintained his entire life, his eyes welled up. A tear escaped, unexpected, and with a choked voice he pleaded, "Please, don't tell anyone." His request hung in the air like a sentence impossible to ignore. "Please, don't tell anyone." The choked voice, choked with fear, didn't seem to belong to the same man everyone knew as a symbol of power and authority. The maid, still kneeling with her cell phone in hand, didn't know whether to look at him or at the screen that had revealed the secret. Her eyes trembled, her mouth half open, unable to utter a word. The millionaire, sensing her silence as a risk, leaned in even closer. His firm hands now gripped her shoulders with an almost desperate grip. His gaze implored her, as if every second were too precious to waste. The guests around him were already beginning to whisper. This wasn't just a discreet conversation between boss and maid, it was something bigger. An elegant lady, sitting a few meters away, leaned over to her friend and murmured in an acidic tone, "Is he begging?" To her. Her friend, confused, simply shook her head. It was unthinkable. The man who never bowed his head to anyone was now nearly on his knees before a young woman in uniform. Rumors spread like wildfire. Glances multiplied. The champagne glasses hung suspended in the air, forgotten. The background music seemed to disappear, swallowed up by the tension that grew by the second. The maid finally stood up, still holding her cell phone. Her face was a mixture of shock and fear. She didn't want to be seen as an enemy, but she couldn't simply pretend nothing had happened. Her lips moved, but only a whisper escaped. "I didn't want to see," the millionaire interrupted, distressed. "Then pretend you didn't see." His voice came out louder than it should have. Several guests jumped. A scandal was now inevitable. The wife across the room frowned. Her eyes narrowed as she noticed the crowd around her husband and the maid. She rose slowly, gliding among the guests, her posture erect and her heels echoing like a spoken word. With each step, the hubbub grew louder. The millionaire noticed the approach and became even more desperate. He grabbed the maid's hand again, almost silently pleading. A tear ran down his face, and this scene, witnessed by everyone, was enough to turn rumors into certainty. Something terrible was hidden there. Some guests covered their mouths in horror. Others smiled secretly, savoring the downfall of someone who had always seemed unreachable. The young woman, however, remained paralyzed. Her cell phone still glowed in her hand, like a bomb about to explode. And when the wife came close enough to see her husband's teary eyes and the maid's stunned face, the entire room knew the evening would not end without a devastating revelation. The wife's footsteps echoed through the hall like hammers against marble. Each click of her heels seemed to announce that the mask of the luxurious evening was about to crack. The guests, already murmuring intensely, parted for her, with every movement of the blonde woman imposing in her red dress that shimmered under the golden light of the chandeliers. The feeling was that a trial was about to begin. The maid, still stunned, held her cell phone in her hands. The millionaire, now with teary eyes, looked like a man stripped of all his sovereignty. The two stood in the spotlight in the center of the room, surrounded by burning gazes. The scene was scandalous in itself. The most powerful man in the city, begging before a young woman who, until minutes ago, had been nothing more than the invisible shadow of the house. When the wife finally approached, silence fell over everyone. Her expression was one of restrained fury, but there was also a calculated coldness in her clear eyes. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't demand an explanation. She simply stared at the cell phone in the maid's hands, and that was enough for everyone to realize. She knew. Maybe not the details, but she knew there was something there that could ruin everything. "What did you see?" his wife asked, her voice sharp as a razor. The maid stammered, trying to explain herself, but the millionaire interrupted her before any words could come out. "Nothing! She saw nothing!" he shouted, his voice too desperate to be convincing. Shock coursed through the guests like an electric wave. That man, always so cold, always so ruthless, was now completely vulnerable. The contrast was almost unbearable. The wife narrowed her eyes and for a moment seemed to smile. It wasn't a smile of joy but of bitter triumph. As if faced with her husband's weakness, she finally had confirmation of what she had always suspected. "So, that's it," he murmured, loud enough for many to hear. "You kneel. Not for me, not for them, but for her." The words struck the millionaire like blows. He didn't respond. He simply lowered his head, unable to meet his wife's gaze. The frightened maid felt trapped in a trap she hadn't chosen. Her body trembled. Her heart seemed to want to escape her chest, and yet, behind the fear, there was a spark of something greater, a truth that now belonged to her and that no one could erase. The entire room no longer saw just an accident. It saw a revelation about to happen. Every guest knew they were witnessing a night they would remember forever, the night the most powerful man was reduced to tears in front of his own wife and a simple maid. The cell phone gleamed in the maid's hands as if it were a sacred object, capable of deciding fates. Every second she took to react seemed to stretch time and increase the tension in the room. The guests were entranced, all aware that this device was now worth more than all the gold and jewelry displayed that night. The millionaire, still hunched over, tears streaming, tried to cover his face to hide his shame. The man who dominated business circles, who never took no for an answer, was now reduced to pleading with someone he himself would have considered invisible hours before. But the invisibility was over. The wife, firmly in her red dress, never took her eyes off her phone. Every step she took toward the couple made the guests hold their breath. Her face was a mixture of fury and relief. Fury at being exposed in front of everyone, and relief at finally seeing the empire of lies crumble before witnesses. "Give it to me," his wife ordered, her voice as cold as ice. The maid hesitated. Her hands trembled. She didn't want to be there, didn't want to be the center of a scandal. But fate had placed her in the position of judge. The millionaire, desperate, grabbed the young woman's arm with more force than he should have. "Don't do this. Please." His voice was already a sob, as if with each word he would fall apart even more. The whispers grew louder. Some guests leaned forward, eager to see the contents. Others murmured about how that powerful man had knelt before their maid. That was humiliation enough, even without the secret being revealed. But there was something greater, the expectation of the truth. The maid, her eyes brimming with tears, looked at them both. On one side, her vulnerable boss, trying to hide something that could destroy his life. On the other, his wife, demanding revenge, or perhaps justice. In the middle, she herself, unable to understand how she had become a key player in a cruel game. Suddenly, the wife stepped forward. Her fingers almost touched her cell phone, but the maid instinctively recoiled. The room gasped in unison, as if a shock had run through the air. The young woman didn't want to choose sides, but her every move seemed to decide everyone's future. The millionaire, in a desperate gesture, fell to his knees before her. The tears now flowed unchecked. His voice echoed, torn with pain. "I beg you, if you tell me what you saw, it will all end." The sentence reverberated like thunder. The guest's eyes widened. The wife smiled bitterly. The maid trembled. The cell phone, gleaming in her hands, was no longer just a device. It was the key to the entire empire of appearances that family had built. And deep down, everyone knew it no longer mattered what was on the screen. The simple fact that he had knelt was proof that the secret was real. The hall was no longer a space for celebration. It was an arena. Each guest whispered as if they were witnessing a forbidden spectacle, and the whispers grew louder and louder, like waves crashing against the golden walls. There was no music, no laughter, only the heavy rumble of collective judgment. The maid, motionless, held her cell phone in both hands. The glow of the screen illuminated her face, reflecting the gravity of what she had seen. Her chest rose and fell with rapid breaths, and her eyes betrayed a whirlwind of emotions: fear, indignation, doubt. She hadn't asked to be in this position, but now everyone expected something of her. The millionaire remained on his knees, breathing raggedly, his face red and wet with tears. His hands gripped the hem of the young woman's uniform as if that gesture could prevent his imminent fall. The man who had so often been seen as untouchable was now reduced to the pathetic image of a subject begging for silence from someone he had previously ignored. His wife, arms crossed, watched the scene with icy eyes. Her expression was one of bitter triumph, but also impatience. To her, the truth was nothing new. It simply needed to be revealed in front of everyone, as a public punishment. Her restrained smile made it clear. The more he humbled himself, the more satisfied she would be. The guests, divided, didn't know who to support. Some looked at the maid with compassion, recognizing in her an innocence that shouldn't carry so much weight. Others, however, cheered on the spectacle, eager to see the powerful man fall. It was as if the entire room had become complicit, spectators of a tragedy that could no longer be stopped. Suddenly, one of the older guests raised her voice, breaking the collective. Murmur, "Tell me what you saw." The entire room turned to the maid. Her heart raced, her hands sweating around her cell phone. The millionaire, in tears, shook his head, silently pleading. His wife, motionless, held his gaze, as if she were a judge awaiting the verdict. The young woman's throat felt dry. Each second seemed to stretch on like an eternity. There was no easy way out. If she spoke, she would destroy a life, perhaps an empire. If she remained silent, she would carry the weight of a secret that could poison her forever. The phone beeped again in his hands, a new notification lighting up the screen. The sound made the guests hold their breath. The millionaire let out a muffled groan, as if fate itself were mocking him. His wife smiled cruelly. The maid, weak, took a step back. Her expression was a mixture of horror and paralysis. The room was closing in, eyes surrounding her like a hungry mob. The pressure was unbearable. Everyone wanted blood. And in that moment, the young woman realized she no longer had a choice. The secret was no longer just hers, it was everyone's. And it was about to become impossible to hide. The atmosphere was no longer just one of discomfort, it was one of collective fear. The entire room seemed to breathe in time with the rising tension. The millionaire remained kneeling, his eyes red, his hands trembling. The maid clutched her cell phone like a ticking time bomb, and his wife, erect in her red dress, watched the scene like a cold judge, waiting only for the sentence to be pronounced. The guests were restless. Some rose from their chairs, others approached cautiously, as if not wanting to miss any detail of what could be the biggest scandal ever seen in that mansion. Murmurs spread like wildfire. She knows something. He's finished. What did she discover? The maid, her breath quickening, could no longer hide the shock etched on her face. The words exchanged between her and the millionaire echoed within her like an unbearable weight. Don't tell anyone. His plea had already been witnessed by dozens of eyes, and that alone was enough to implode his image as an untouchable man. But there was more. There was what was recorded on his cell phone. The wife, taking a few steps forward, let her voice cut through the air like a blade. If you have something to hide, everyone here already knows it's serious. The sentence fell like a sentence. The millionaire brought his hands to his face, unable to hold his gaze. The hall murmured even louder. Each guest became judge and executioner, tasting the bitter taste of the downfall of a man who had made them so fearful. The maid, feeling the crushing pressure, nearly dropped her cell phone. Her body trembled, her eyes filled with tears. She fought back. She didn't want to be there, didn't want to be responsible for destroying lives. But the truth could no longer be erased. The secret she'd seen without meaning to could not be undone. The millionaire raised his face, in supplication, tears flowing freely. I lose everything, everything, if you open your mouth. The guests gasped. They had never imagined they would hear such a confession from him. His wife pressed her lips together, a cruel smile appearing, as if she finally had the confirmation she sought. There was no longer any doubt. The empire she had helped build was built on lies, and now it was crumbling before everyone's eyes. The young maid, amidst the heavy silence, stammered in a weak voice. I didn't want to, but now everyone knows. The room erupted in murmurs. Eyes met in shock. The millionaire slumped even further, nearly falling sideways, as if he'd been struck by an invisible blow. His wife lifted her chin triumphantly as the guests anxiously awaited his next move. The night that had begun as a lavish party was now a public tribunal, and everyone knew the final verdict was near. The entire room felt like a makeshift courtroom. The millionaire, prostrate on the floor, was no longer the center of power. The cell phone in the maid's hands was the symbol of a destiny that could be destroyed with a single gesture. But it was when his wife approached that the atmosphere became unbearable. She advanced with deliberate steps, her red dress dragging across the marble like a living flame. Her blue eyes sparkled, reflecting hatred and, at the same time, a strange sense of victory. She approached the maid and looked her up and down. The contrast was stark. On one side, the boss, blonde, powerful, surrounded by luxury. On the other, the young black woman in a short, low-cut uniform, her hands still trembling. But that night, the roles were reversed. The waitress slowly raised her gaze. Her teary eyes showed not submission, but shock and astonishment, as if she were realizing she carries within herself something much greater than she had imagined. For a moment, the entire room fell even more silent. It was as if everyone were witnessing an invisible duel, a clash, that needed no shouting to be devastating. The wife took a step closer, her voice low but sharp. "Do you think you can ruin what we've built? One word from you, and it all comes crashing down." The waitress felt her body tremble. She didn't want to be there, didn't want to be the one responsible for exposing a secret that wasn't hers. But her wounded dignity, the humiliation she'd suffered minutes before, and the weight of everyone's gaze forced her not to back down. The guests watched, fascinated and terrified. Some gripped their glasses tightly, as if the glass would slip from their hands. Others leaned forward, hanging on every word. The tension was almost physical, cutting through the air. Then the young woman murmured in a trembling voice, but firm enough to be heard, "I didn't ask to see, but now everyone knows there's something there." The sentence reverberated through the room like an invisible punch. Eyes turned to the millionaire, who shrank even further to the floor, his face hidden in his hands. His wife smiled bitterly, not because she had won, but because the silent war was now exposed. The dueling stares continued. The maid, frail as she was, supported everyone's weight. The furious wife watched the empire of appearances crumble, and the guests knew the evening would not end without the truth coming to light. The cell phone still glowed in the maid's hands like a forbidden beacon. With every second, the silence grew more suffocating, and the guests' gazes grew heavier. The party was gone. There was no music, no laughter. The entire room breathed only tension and fear. The millionaire, kneeling, wiped away the tears that wouldn't stop falling. His image was already shattered. The man who had always inspired respect and awe was now just a shadow of himself, hunched over and pleading, but there was still something in his eyes, a mixture of desperation and survival instinct. He knew he couldn't stop the inevitable, but he would try to control how the fall would unfold. "Give it back to me," he begged, reaching out with trembling hands toward his phone. "You don't understand. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. If you tell, you'll ruin lives." The words echoed in the hall, sparking even more murmurs. Some guests backed away, as if they were guilty of the secret. Others approached, eager to discover its contents. The air was thick with suspicion. His wife, as still as a statue of ice, crossed her arms. Her expression betrayed no pity, only bitter triumph. "So it's true," he murmured, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You've always had something to hide." The guest's eyes followed her. She seemed to savor every second of her husband's humiliation. She didn't just want the truth, she wanted revenge. The maid, lost between the two, felt her legs weaken. Her mouth was dry and her hands were sweating as she held the device. The lit screen seemed to pulse, as if the secret recorded there had a life of its own. With each notification that popped up, her heart raced even faster. The millionaire, in a desperate gesture, suddenly stood up. He advanced toward the maid, trying to snatch the cell phone from her hands. The entire room gasped. The young woman recoiled, nearly stumbling, but held onto the phone firmly. Her eyes widened, and her mouth opened in a muffled scream. "No!" The impact of that single word brought the silence back with a vengeance. The millionaire froze, his teary eyes fixed on hers. For the first time, he seemed to understand what he had lost. Not just control over his cell phone, but control over his entire life. The guests watched in astonishment. Some covered themselves in shame, Others smiled discreetly at the fall of the powerful man. The wife, with a slight gasp of satisfaction, stepped forward and declared, "What was hidden no longer matters. Your plea before her is the proof we all needed." The millionaire fell to his knees again, his body trembling, as if carrying the weight of the world. The maid, tears in her eyes, stood firm. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was more deafening than any revelation. The cell phone was no longer just an object. It was a symbol of ruin. The room was plunged into a heavy silence, broken only by the kneeling millionaire's labored breathing and the stifled whispers that spread throughout the tables. The cell phone glowed in the maid's hands, like a torch illuminating the truth hidden from everyone. His wife, motionless, kept her chin raised, as if she already considered herself the winner. The shocked guests awaited the final verdict. But then the waitress, the most unlikely character of the evening, made a decision no one expected. With slow steps, she walked to the center of the room. Her eyes were teary, but her posture was firm. The millionaire tried to grab her bar again, but she recoiled, raising the device high. The gesture made everyone hold their breath. She could have destroyed a life. She could have exposed the secret before everyone, imploding the empire that had crushed them with arrogance for so many years. But instead, the young woman took a deep breath and, in a firm voice, declared, "I don't need to say anything. You've seen enough." The impact was devastating. It wasn't just silence. It was a symbolic sentence, one that confronted each person present. They didn't need the words. They didn't need to see the contents of the phone, the millionaire's mere despair, his tears. Before his maid were the greatest confession possible. The wife's eyes widened for a moment, taken aback by the young woman's stance. She expected screams, she expected revenge, but she received something even more lethal, the strength of dignity. Without revealing anything, the maid had turned the party into a courtroom, and everyone knew the verdict. The defeated millionaire dropped his face into his hands. The sound of his crying echoed through the hall, and no one dared approach. The guests averted their eyes, embarrassed to have been complicit, to have made fun of the young woman just moments before, and now to be faced with a truth that could not be erased. The maid then took the final step in what would become her silent victory. Calmly, she turned off her cell phone screen and placed it on the main table. She didn't hand it over to either the millionaire or his wife. She simply left it there, like an ownerless object, a symbol of what had been revealed without words. Then she walked to the exit. Her steps were firm, erect, as if they no longer carried the weight of humiliation, but rather that of freedom. The short dress, once a source of judgmental glances, now seemed like armor. Her figure crossed the room, and every gaze followed her in silence, no longer with contempt but with respect. The music, which had ceased, began to play softly again. It wasn't joyful, it wasn't festive, it was melancholic, almost funereal, the symbolic mourning of a destroyed reputation, the burial of a perfect image that never existed. The wife remained motionless like a defeated queen, whose arrogance, even in her inability to prevent the inevitable, could not. The millionaire wept on the floor, and all the other guests knew they would never forget that night. And that was how, without revealing the secret, the maid achieved the greatest revenge. She turned silence into her weapon, and let each person's conscience carry the weight of guilt and shame. That night, the most powerful truth was not spoken, it was felt. If this story touched you, leave a like and subscribe to follow more stories like this.